government in the charter as another level of government, and that in fact there would be 3 levels of government in this province. It never did come to the fore, and I do know that the former premier and the former mayor of the city of Dartmouth, John Savage, who was president of the UN of the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, had in fact even given some serious thought to making sure that municipal government would be a standalone government and that it would have powers within its rights to do so. So what happened here is that the government seen that it gave powers to the municipality to look after the interests of its citizens and to protect its citizens, which the Halifax Regional Municipality did. They dealt with that through the smoking legislation that which would put a total ban on public and private business that they dealt with the citizens at large, a total ban on smoking. And they brought in that total ban on smoking, which affected the casino. The government looked at it and said that, well, look, we'll look at this as there's a legal implication here, and that we maybe, have to buy out a $178 million casino operation and be responsible for it. The government is responsible, and so do the businesses know. The government at any day or any time at the provincial and federal level can introduce legislation that might have a significant impact upon that business. The business has a recourse to take it through the courts. And then you can decide then, and only then, when it goes through the courts, as to rather there needs to be legislative change with respect to it. Now, I believe there needs to be some clarity, because they said that the casino at Centre 200 in Sydney has been operating for 2 years with a total smoking ban. But my understanding is that's not the case. There was a partial smoking ban at the Sydney casino, that there was not a total smoking ban, and that in fact the total smoking ban comes into effect this year, I do believe, and it comes into effect in July of 2003. So there is some concern, although the management of Centre 200 Casino had indicated that there was not a problem with them, and that they would, at this particular time, at least experiment to see what kind of an effect it would have upon their casino. Was prepared to at least listen to the elected body of CBRM, and they would in turn take their chances and see how it went. The same thing could have applied to the Halifax, the HRM as well, regional municipality. There certainly could have been an experiment, and generally with these experiments, and California is a prime example. The state of California, I think, has a total ban of no smoking, both in public and private facilities, and serving its citizens quite well. There was a decline, Mr. Chairman, on the first 6 months and so on, that in fact people did tend to stay away, but after the 6 months period, they gradually realized that there was a continuous flow of patrons coming in to their businesses, and people even commented on how much better it was to be in an environment and to be able to eat food that they could taste and enjoy a leisure time out without having to have secondhand smoke. Now there is the Skinner situation that was here most recently at the Halifax Casino, which in fact she was entitled to her EI benefits, and there's also the Heather Crow one with respect to the workers' compensation in Canada, but I'm not going to go into that, because I believe that, Mr. Chairman, there are going to be many more of those cases if government doesn't assume its responsible role. Because where does government then become negligent? If someone becomes ill as a condition of their workplace employment. And I can tell you, Mr. Chairman, that it's extremely important that government, who has legislation with respect to occupational health and safety, and a government who is responsible for crafting labor legislation in this province, is the very same government whom in fact also has the responsibility for looking after the best interests of Nova Scotians. I know that there have been the arguments that, people know the conditions of employment before they go there, And they have the opportunity not to seek employment. But that's not true, Mr. Chairman. Many of us seek employment into places because we want that first step in the door, and when we want to be able to get employment into fields and have careers that we think that we're capable of working in, and not only that, careers that we enjoy. And there are some people who enjoy meeting the public, and there's nothing wrong with meeting the public in restaurants and serving the public and casinos and pubs and bars. Everyone has their niche of employment. And as a result of that, that doesn't mean that we as government ought to say that because they have accepted that as a part of their employment, that there's no responsibility on us for the health and well-being of our citizens. Because, Mr. Chairman, I would say to you that in fact that is exactly why we're here. And it's important to know, Mr. Chairman,
1 minute, Jerry.
that on this side,
He's got you.
it's important to say that, Mr. Chairman, on this side of the legislative floor, we believe that we're here to make government accountable. And it's quite evident, if anyone knows, that that's exactly what we have done here. And it's our job to certainly look after the interest of Nova Scotians and today's Nova Scotia families. And in today's Nova Scotia families, that's exactly what we do as on this side of the legislative floor. We don't simply sit here and think about how many votes we can get out of something. We certainly look at the policy. We look at the legislation that were brought forward. It's well thought out. It's there's a tremendous amount of research that goes in it, and we touch base with the Nova Scotian public. Much the same as a task force on auto insurance. So, Mr. Chairman, that's just one example, and I can name a number of examples. But, Mr. Chairman, I guess you're telling me that my time is expired, so thank you.
Order. Thank you to the member from Dartmouth North. I recognize the member from Glace Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I really don't know where to start, but I'll find a place. But I did want to tell the person that will be coming after me, Mr. Speaker, that indeed I may not be taking all of the full hour that I'm entitled to, but I'll be taking a portion of it. Let me start off, Mr. Speaker, by saying I'm sure all members would join me in wishing the Halifax Mooseheads luck in their game tonight, so I'll start out by doing that. I understand that this could be the deciding game tonight, that the Mooseheads could take it, but I also understand that probably, not that I want to wish them bad luck or anything, but I'm sure that Scott Ferguson down at the Metro Centre would welcome a seventh and deciding game at the Metro Centre, but I don't want to see it go that far. I'd like the Mooseheads to wrap it up tonight and move on from there, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I listened with great interest to the speaker before me, the member for Dartmouth North, but I had to correct when I remind myself to correct historically what the member was talking about in some respects, Mr. Chairman, because it's important that when history is written, you have your facts right, Mr. Speaker, and you have to get your facts right when it comes to the political scene in Nova Scotia. And the political scene, as we see it right now in Nova Scotia, was created by the NDP, Mr. Chairman. Okay, that's a fact, because if we go back to 1999, Mr. Chair, if we go back to 1999, the fact of the matter is that crew over there was put there by this crew to my right, or this is the crew to the right that's to the left. If you're following, Mr. Chair, you'll understand what I mean. But anyway, the historical facts of the matter is that we would not have had to endure 4 very long years of the Tories if it hadn't been for the power and hunger of the NDP to put them there in the first place, Mr. Chair. Now, that's a historical fact that history will write, and eventually we'll take a look back and say, boy, that was probably the biggest mistake we've ever made in Nova Scotia, was for that Tory government to come to power. Now, Mr. Chair, one also has to look at the fact that we have to remind, well, I wasn't there, Mr. Chair, at the time. I wasn't there, but I did follow politics very closely. And we know that the then leader of the NDP, this was the previous leader, before they ate the next leader, okay, and then spit her out into nowhere land. Before that happened, Mr. Chair, we know that at least in our case, at least in the Liberal case, our honourable leader did the honourable thing and stepped away from political life, Mr. Speaker. He just didn't drift into the backbenches and still can be found in the House today, you know.
Order. I'm somewhat familiar with the topics of which the member speaks, but I'm not clear on how it's related to Bill number 36, the Financial Measures Act. So maybe if the member could draw us back into Bill number 36 and explain to us the connection, I'll be very interested in hearing it.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I welcome the opportunity. I understand I may have been trying to draw a long bow there, but I will bring you back because, Mr. Chair, you know what this Financial Measures Act has become is it's just a last gasp by this government before it goes to the poll. Much the same as the last gasp that the NDP did when they brought in this government in the first place back at that time. That's the relevance, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate you for. Now, the relevance of this right now, Mr. Chair. I'm glad I've awoken some of the members, Mr. Chair. The relevance of what we're talking about here right now is it's up to us to remind people of exactly what this government has stood for over the last 4 years. Now, Mr. Chair, this is a government that has stood for strikes against nurses, Bill 68, the measures they brought in. It has stood for paramedics who had to go on strike against this government. It has stood now for the RSS who are striking against this government. They tried it with the teachers, but they backed off, and then they got scared pretty quick, Mr. Chair. This is a government that has stood for user fees. They have increased just about anything you could possibly lay your hands on, Mr. Chair. It's also a government that has stood for flip-flop after flip-flop after flip-flop, and it's a government that has stood for, over 4 years, total mismanagement that has led us to the situation that we find ourselves in now in terms of the debt in Nova Scotia. This is a government that has stood for, Mr. Chair, that now we spend more money servicing the debt than we spend on education itself. Over $1 billion that we spend servicing the debt, which is more than what we spend on our children in education. So overall, you know, it's also a government, Mr. Chair, that has stood for stealing ideas, okay? That has stood for...
Order. I think the member knows that the use of that term in that context would not be parliamentary, and I ask that he retract it, please.
I will, Mr. Chair. I retract that immediately. They've probably taken someone else's ideas without authorization. There's probably a better way of saying it, Mr. Chair. You know, we can take a look at issue after issue, whether it's insurance, and you know. The NDP stands up en masse and says, that's our idea, and they pat themselves on the back. Sunday shopping is another issue, Mr. Chair. It's another issue. Health and wellness is another issue, Mr. Chair. You know, there's everything you could possibly think of that this government has said, well, that's a good idea. It's not ours, but let's take it and let's try and institute it. But the only problem is, Mr. Chair, is they haven't done a really good job of doing that when the time came around. So there are half measures, Mr. Chair, that really go nowhere. And you need look no further, Mr. Chair, than if you take a look at some of the big ticket items. Let's take a look at health care. Okay, Mr. Chair, in this province. Let's take a look at what the previous health minister did for health care before he passed on and turned it over to the current health minister, Mr. Chair. Now, I could say very easily that it would be nothing. I wouldn't have to speak at all, because that's what has occurred. Absolutely nothing, Mr. Chair. There's nothing to be proud of. There's nothing to say, this is what we've done. We still have a situation in this province in health care where there are long waiting lists. There are emergency room closures. They're in Glace Bay, they still exist. In the Richmond area, in the Strait area, they still exist. We're still looking for doctors in this province. We still have the problems that existed 4 years ago, Mr. Chair. And now new problems pop up from time to time, as we've read today, that we're in a sorry state as far as X-ray technicians are concerned in this province too, at St. Martha's Hospital in Antigonish. So, Mr. Chair, we know that the problems still exist. 4 years ago they were there. They're here now. So we're here to remind people that this is what this government has stood for 4 years. They've stood for absolutely nothing. Let's take a look, Mr. Chair. We talked about this in debate the other day. We took a look at the casino issue, in particular the charity casino in Sydney, which is a matter near and dear to my heart because I happened to introduce a private member's bill in this legislature to reinstate at least 2 times, I think. I lost track, but at least 2 times I've introduced that bill to reinstate the Sydney charity casino. All they had to do, and they are the people, this government took that charity casino when they came to power, and they said, no. Where did it go? 50% of the profits from that casino will no longer go to charities. Well, they never got to charities. It was an idea. It was an idea of the former Liberal government to give those monies to charity, but now they go into general revenue in the province of Nova Scotia. Shame. Not 1 cent has ever reached the charity in this province, Mr. Chair. So that, as I said, that's a matter near and dear to me because I thought, as I tried to explain the other day in debate, a little bit of money goes a long way for charities. So if a charity applied to the Sydney Charity Casino and got $1,000 from them, to some charities that means the difference between whether or not they continue to operate for the entire year, whether or not they put a new roof on their organization's headquarters or whatever, whether or not they pay for their heat, whether or not they just simply exist, Mr. Chair. So it's important that I thought it was important to keep reintroducing that bill. But this is a government that has turned its back on charities. Not even a word was mentioned about that bill, Mr. Chair. It's a government that, we're on the topic of health care, Mr. Chair, and I'll stay there just for a minute, although as I said, it could be easily summed up by saying absolutely nothing, and that would give you an illustration of exactly what this government has done on health care, Mr. Chair. We take a look at the budget that was allotted for health and wellness, Mr. Chair, which is, I mean, how else could you describe it but a joke? That's a joke, Mr. Chair. It's again an idea that was certainly borrowed, okay, I guess somewhat permanently from another party. In particular, it was borrowed from our caucus, Mr. Chair. That's where it came from, Mr. Chair. And let's keep going on the matter of health, Mr. Chair. I've raised this at least 20 times in this legislature. The fact that, if not more, Mr. Chair, I can guarantee you, the fact that, we're in a situation in Glace Bay, we're in the emergency department at Glace Bay. Unless you've been listening to the radio or reading the newspaper, sometimes when you show up there, you don't know whether it's going to be opened or closed, Mr. Chair. In the year 2003, to be left in a situation that you can't go to an emergency department which should be fully staffed and which should be operational with doctors, that this government has allowed that situation to continue in that area, my area, and in other areas such as the Strait area is absolutely ridiculous, Mr. Chair. Absolutely ridiculous. But it's a common occurrence. It happened last year, some 32 times that it happened last year, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, if you take a look at the issue of education, Mr. Chair, now go no further than that. This government has let our children down, Mr. Chair. This government has let parents down. This government has let educators down. And it is a serious situation, Mr. Chair, when our children are bringing home math scores on average which are as low as 32%, Mr. Chair. It is a shame. It's a disgrace for the province of Nova Scotia and for education in this province to be at the state that it's in right now, Mr. Chair. It's absolutely disgraceful that this government has tried to blame everyone else for its mistakes, not only in education but in other fields. They always take a look back. Oh, the previous government was to blame for that. But the fact of the matter is, whether it's education or health or whatever the topic may be. This government has been in power for 4 years come July 27th. 4 years in which they've had ample time to sit back and take a look at the problems that face this province and come up with solutions, Mr. Chair. 4 long years they've been in power, and people have been waiting for them to come up with solutions. Solutions that, well, if you recall, when I first came here, one of the big ticket items that was being discussed at the time was Sunday shopping. Sunday shopping was a red-hot item in Nova Scotia. Well, a topic for discussion anyway, I should say. And the government decided that they would put that issue in the hands of the Red Tape Task Force, which was a task force, I think, which, if I recall correctly, spent the summer.
Who sat on that?
Which was made up by, I don't know how many Tory backbench MLAs were on it, but I know how many opposition MLAs were on it. None, absolutely none. But those Tory backbench MLAs went around the province. We referred to them in a rather, I don't think it was mean, it was a rather joking way that we referred to them as the boys of summer, because they were having a great summer touring the province, looking for all the answers on the Red Tape Task Force. Well, lo and behold, one of the recommendations that came back from the Red Tape Task Force, if my memory serves me correctly, was that they put Sunday shopping back in the hands of the municipalities. That was the answer, back in the hands of the municipalities. Now, Mr. Chair, it turns out, I guess, that the Premier and the Cabinet didn't really like that idea. They didn't think it was a great idea. So the Premier then, or I'm speculating, probably instructed the Minister of, a Minister at the time, the Minister of Justice at the time, to say that Sunday shopping was off the books. There'd be no discussion about Sunday shopping
Until when?
until the year 2005, Mr. Speaker, 2005. Well, Mr. Speaker, here we are in 2003, and all of a sudden there's been one of those major flip-flops that I was talking about, Mr. Speaker. One of the flip-flops that you'll find contained in the Financial Measures Act as well, Mr. Speaker. I continue to draw attention to the half measures that are contained in the Financial Measures Act, Mr. Chair. And I know I continue to stretch the limits of relevance to the greatest extent, Mr. Chair, but I make no apologies for that, because I want to make sure that people know just how much of a last gasp this is on behalf of this government with this Financial Measures Act. All they want to do is to get this approved so that they can go to the polls, Mr. Chair. That's all they want to do. But what they don't, what's holding back right now, and this has been a great topic of discussion among the, at the water coolers and in the coffee shops and all that, is, well, why haven't they gone? Why haven't they gone to the polls yet, Mr. Chair? Well, it probably would be because they thought the $155 check was the be-all and end-all, and that it was going to be a great thing going into an election campaign, that everybody was going to get back, well, not everybody, but I'll deal with that in a minute, but people would be getting back the $155 check from that rum bottle budget that everybody now talks about. But lo and behold, the good people of Nova Scotia had the common sense to take a look at that check as nothing more than a means of trying to buy their vote.
So what did Tory polling?
And Mr. Chair, now that they've realized that the people aren't going to fall for it, in no way are they going to fall for it, then they've had to say, whoa, hold on for a minute. We may not want to go right at this moment. So let's hold on and see what people are saying out there about this issue. And I dare say, if you look at the polling that the Tories have done, Mr. Chair, in some cases, polling that has been done with, I should add, taxpayers' money, Mr. Chair. Shame on that government. They've done it time and time again with taxpayers' money. From the very first day they were elected, everything from buying backdrops for announcements to polling that has been done on the back of taxpayers in Nova Scotia, Mr. Chair. And shame on them for doing that. But they're looking at that polling now and they're saying, well, maybe this wasn't a great idea. It might be like the Sunday shopping issue. We might have to flip-flop on that issue as well, too, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, if you take a look at the issue of user fees, Mr. Chair, that has been evident from this as this government took over,
From birth to death.
they have put everything on from the time you were born to the time you die in this province. Now costs you more. It costs you more
Jamie's fault.
for a birth certificate. It costs you more for a death certificate. It costs you more for licenses. It costs you more. This one I've ran into personally, Mr. Speaker, not because of me, but of a relative of mine. It costs you more to change your name in Nova Scotia. At one time, it used to cost you $25. Now it costs you $125
To change your name.
to change your name
Oh,
in
they
Nova
can't
Scotia. Grabbing money from every which way they can, Mr. Speaker, or Mr. Chair. They're just out there with user fees, and they've attached it to every possible thing they can think of. And no matter which way you shape it, no matter which way you mold it, a user fee is a tax. The government can say it's not, it's a user fee, but the same ordinary Nova Scotians who saw through the rum bottle budget saw through user fees when they came to, when they were attached to their phone bills or whatever the case may be. They saw those user fees there and they say,
911 fee.
this is a tax, that's right, the 911 fee, which was included. Someone told me the other day, phoned my office, as a matter of fact, with a complaint that the 911 fee has another tax added on top of that. So they're paying on top of that.
Imagine.
And then you get to issues that are starting to rumble the earth even more, Mr. Chair, such as insurance. And I can tell you, my office has been inundated with phone calls about insurance. I'm sure your office is the same. And a lot of other MLAs, including the government MLAs, would be hearing from people who are tremendously upset about the rise in insurance rates and what this government has decided, well, actually not to do about the whole thing. It's backfiring there as well, Mr. Chair. So we remind Nova Scotians what the government stood for the last 4 years is absolutely nothing, Mr. Chair.
How much more of
The casinos and the smoking issue. Yeah. Mr. Chair, it's another flip-flop, but let me tell you, it's pretty clear in my mind. It's pretty clear in my mind, and it's pretty clear in the minds of many municipalities across this province that the way to go is 100% smoke-free. You have a smoke-free act. You have a smoke-free bill. The only problem with it, it's not entirely smoke-free. Take it from somebody like myself who spent 30 years trying to quit smoking, Mr. Chair, that it's probably the best lesson that we can pass on to our children. And if we have to do it in the form of legislation, it's the right thing to do. And if we have to teach, whether it be a casino or whatever, that they have to obey and stay by the laws of this province, then we have to do it, Mr. Chair.
health and safety?
But we don't do it. It's a matter of health and safety, of occupational safety. It's a matter of rights of the workers who work in casinos, Mr. Chair. And if we have to do it, by telling a casino that they are going to do this while they're in Nova Scotia, then, Mr. Chair, so be it. But we don't do it by saying to the managers of that casino or to their lawyers or whatever that here's what we're going to do. We'll show you our hand. I hate to use the analogy, gambling. We'll show you our hand first. Now, what do you think of that? That's not the way you do it. It's not the way you negotiate, Mr. Chair. And as I've said before, you can pretty well negotiate anything. You can renegotiate anything. Any of my colleagues here who are in the legal profession, Mr. Speaker, would be glad, I'm sure, to give you a great dissertation on what you can and cannot negotiate and what's open to negotiation. Pretty well anything on the face of the earth is open to negotiation. So how can you say that you have a binding contract that's there and there's nothing that can be done about it? That's not what it says at all, Mr. Chair. What it says is that there's room for negotiation. What this government did is tell them their position first and then say, what are we going to do about it? Now, anybody knows, Mr. Chair, anybody who watches television and watches any kind of a show that involves common law practices would know that. You can negotiate. You can negotiate. And believe me, Mr. Chair, I'm the furthest thing from a lawyer you could ever find. That's very simple solution to what's happening with the casino. If you talk to anybody, they'll say put health and safety first.
Here, here.
That has to come first. Anybody in this province, anybody would tell you that has to be the paramount issue that you put forward first. One of health and safety of the individual, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chair, what could be any more important than that? So as I said, as
What
I,
do you do with the contract with Newfoundland?
as I said, Mr. Chair, this has been a government that has a history of flip-flops and mismanagement, whether it be financial, whether it be the oil industry, whether it be negotiating with Newfoundland on the boundary dispute.
Almost lost Glace Bay.
We saw what happened there. Yeah. My friend and colleague from Richmond says in a joking way that we almost lost Glace Bay. But you know, when you looked at the maps when they were negotiating the boundary with Newfoundland, if they had allowed it to happen, if it had actually happened the way it was proposed, we would have lost half of Glace Bay. It would have been right up on the shoreline, and I think Newfoundlanders would have been dipping their toes or in the Glace Bay water, Mr. Chair. But let's not go there because it was close enough. That's for sure. That this government was about to sell everything down the tubes, Mr. Chair, down the tubes. So what we see. I'll give you another example, Mr. Chair, of the lack of involvement on behalf of this government. The revitalization program in Glace Bay, the downtown revitalization program. The federal government has money that's involved, Mr. Chair. The municipality, the Cape Breton Regional Municipality, is involved as well, and the provincial government involvement, Mr. Chair, is zip, absolutely nothing.
Just gave Shetty Camp
For Glace Bay. But we've seen lots of other instances, and I guess it may be because of the politics involved here, Mr. Chair. I hope not, because it's certainly something that the Ham government said they wouldn't be involved with, is playing that kind of crass politics with people. But it may be something that we've seen in this instance, Mr. Chair, that may have played a part, because their involvement on that is absolutely nothing, Mr. Chair. So again, we're here. Our job, I think, Mr. Chair, as part of this debate, is to remind Nova Scotians of exactly what this government has stood for over the past 4 years. And again, Mr. Chair, they've stood for absolutely nothing. They have not been standing up on behalf of the people of Nova Scotia. They have not been doing what is right for the people of Nova Scotia. And Mr. Chair, it's a great chance now that we're just about to go to the polls. And I would dare say we're not too far behind Premier Lord of New Brunswick, would be my guess, as to when we finally go to the polls, although no one knows for sure, Mr. Chair, except perhaps the Premier of this province, when we'll be going to the polls. But I would hazard a guess as to say that Nova Scotians will be lying in wait, I think would be the proper phrase, for the chance to finally tell this government what they think of things such as the Financial Measures Act, what they think about rum-bottle budgets, what they think about Bill 68, what they think about user fees, what they think about how this government is treating people, everything from the residential workers to the nurses who they were extremely cruel to, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Chair, we all know that. We were here at the time, and we saw how nurses in this province were treated at that time. Do you think anybody in this province will ever forget that? Do you think anybody can forget that? Do you think that one single nurse in this province will let anyone forget that? That they're not going to remind people at election time that this is how this government treated them, and nothing has changed over the past 4 years? That government would do it again.
Bill 68 still in the books?
They'd do it again, the drop of a hat. Bill 68 is still on the books. Still on the books, Mr. Chair. And it's there because this government would use it at a moment's notice.
You wonder why we have a shortage of
They would not hesitate. And yes, as my colleague says, you wonder why we face situations such as a shortage of nurses in this province. Well, Mr. Chair, that's a perfect example as to why we face those shortages, because people have become sick and tired of putting up with a government such as that in this province. There's always one way. Yeah, they get no respect, absolutely no respect, to quote a famous person. And the perfect example of that, Mr. Chair, would be the recent comment from the Deputy Premier about civil servants, Mr. Chair, and what he thought about them in terms of whether or not they could run the insurance industry in this province.
Yeah.
Now, there's a perfect example, but I must say it wasn't unexpected by civil servants, and it wasn't a surprise. It came as no surprise to any civil service servant in this province that Deputy Premier would say that about civil servants, because they would expect it from anyone on that side, Mr. Chair. So, Mr. Chair, having said that, I said that I would not take up all of my time, and I know that my colleague from the NDP certainly has some solid and pertinent points, as he usually does, to make, and I know he can take up a considerable amount of time, Mr. Chair, because I've listened to him on many occasions. With that in mind, I shall probably return at some other point in time, and I thank you for your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you to the member from Glace Bay. I recognize the member from Halifax-Shabukto.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. There's been so much meandering around the countryside in a leisurely fashion in the debate so far that I rather imagine that viewers at home are wondering, along with some of us here, what exactly it is that is the topic we're supposed to be focused on. This is discussion about Bill 36, which is the Financial Measures Act. Bill 36, the Financial Measures Act, is the government's attempt to implement its budget. We're at a stage in the proceedings in which we're talking generally about what the bill is designed to do. That gives us some latitude, but not perhaps quite so much latitude as we've seen exhibited so far. I Mr. Chair, am going to try to actually speak to the general thrust of the legislation and offer some observations as to ways in which it's inadequate. This is the bill that actually implements the touted tax cut and that makes specific provision for the generation of the checks for $155 for those who qualify for them. That's the essence of this bill, although, of course, it has quite a number of other detailed measures in it. It includes an increase in fees with respect to the Apprenticeship and Trade Qualifications Act, and it also, of course, has the very important provision that deals with the issue of smoking in the local gambling casino in HRM. So the bill itself has matters of substance, but the main focus of this bill is its attempt to put in place the 10% tax cut that was one of the promises that the government made in the 1999 election, and it provides as well for the rebate checks that are going out presumably in mid-June. We hear that the checks are ready now, but the promised date is mid-June for arrival in the hands of those who do qualify for them. So the issue is, and surely our main focus here, is what should the public think about this measure of a proposed tax cut? What should the public think about the offer of $155 checks? I suppose I should say the prospect of $155 checks for those who qualify for them. Should this be seen as something beneficial, or should it be seen as an attempt to catch votes? Should it be seen as something beneficial for the economy, or should it be seen as something that will have either a negative or a negligible effect on the economy? Now, people out there are wondering about the specifics of this, but so far as we can tell from conversations we have with people, from the general reaction of the press, from commentary by columnists, by discussion in community centers and in public places as we all wander around, it doesn't look as if the promise of a tax cut or the prospect of receiving a check for those who do qualify for the check is actually of a lot of interest to people. And you have to wonder, why is that? Why is it the case that people look at this and they don't feel responsive, positively responsive? Clearly, this is a puzzle for the government. Clearly, what the government has done is it's built its whole agenda over the last few years, leading up to the election plan for this year, around a scenario that focuses, in their hopes, on the tax cut and on the rebate checks. Clearly, they had their hopes pinned on this item, and yet the prospect seems to have fallen flat. There's no evidence that the government has risen in the estimation of the public as a result of this maneuver. In fact, the evidence seems to be the other way. The evidence seems to be the government is falling a little bit in the polls. So why is that? Why is it that people have reacted with indifference, perhaps with cynicism? Perhaps they're more sophisticated than the government gave them credit for. Perhaps they actually understand what they're looking at. And for them, for the public, to take that view, surely they've considered exactly what it is that they've been faced with over the last 4 years. Now, the stated government agenda was to balance the books, to do that in an attempt by cutting back on services, and then to offer the tax cut in the last year. This is a very familiar agenda, of course. This is exactly the agenda of the first Mike Harris government in Ontario. This is in a pale imitation, but nonetheless, in its essence, exactly what it is that the first Mike Harris government did in Ontario. And clearly it's the hope of this government that they will be successful, as Mr. Harris was, in winning a second term in government. They even went to the extent, as my colleague from Dartmouth North pointed out, of inventing a commission to deal with transportation in the capital that is getting ready to put in place a toll road, another toll road in Nova Scotia. This is just like the Highway 407. Well, this seems a very peculiar agenda for the government to try to offer to people in Nova Scotia. People in Nova Scotia don't seem to have bought into it. And again, we've got to ask ourselves, why? What do they think when they're offered, some of them are offered, the prospect of a check for $155? Well, different people think different things. Now, fully half of the adult population, of course, knows that they're not going to get the check. Now, that's a fact worth examining immediately. Fully half of the adult population are not going to get the check. Why is that? That's because their incomes were so low that they won't qualify. They won't meet the test, because the legislation says you have to have paid income tax in one of the last 3 taxation years to the government of Nova Scotia. If you haven't, you don't qualify. Well, there are a lot of adults out there who are not obliged to pay income tax to the government of Nova Scotia. Now, they pay a lot of other taxes. If they buy anything in the stores, they pay 15% sales tax. If they pay gasoline, they pay the taxes that are built into that. If they buy home heating fuel, of course, they pay the 15% on that. The necessities, there's no escaping that, and there are taxes built in to the daily necessities that even these low-income Nova Scotians have to purchase in the marketplace. So they pay those taxes. There's no escaping them, but they can escape income tax, because income tax is a relatively progressive item. Progressive in the tax world just means that the less you earn, the less you pay. The more you earn, the more you pay. But fully half of the adult population in Nova Scotia probably doesn't qualify for the check because their incomes are so low, they don't have to pay tax to the provincial government. So right away, there are half of the Nova Scotians out there who know they won't be getting the check. Now, that can certainly account for the fact that this prospect, the prospect of a vote-catching check arriving just prior to a provincial election, has gone over to such ill effect for the government. But what about those people who do qualify for the check? What do they think? Are they impressed? Well, not from the discussions I've had with people. It doesn't seem to impress them. And those people seem to fall into a couple of different categories. There are people who look at it and say, $155? This is a minuscule amount for me personally. It doesn't really matter a lot. They look at it and they say, do I really benefit from getting a check for $155? They look at it and they say, well, sure, get a little money, gives me something I can spend. I'll find something good to do with the money. No doubt they'll donate it to my campaign for re-election, or perhaps to your campaign for re-election, Mr. Chair, something that'll have a good beneficial effect. Nova Scotians are sensible. They'll figure out the right thing to do with those checks. But that's certainly a segment of opinion that I've run into, perhaps you have as well. People look at it and they think, this isn't much, doesn't really impress me. But it gets worse from the government perspective, I've got to tell you. Because there's a segment of the population that looks at this and they say, well, wait a minute. Is the government about to send out checks for $60 or $70 million, which is what the total is going to be, to Nova Scotians, while at the same time it's continuing to run up its debt? People have put that together. I've heard comments from people who say, wait a minute, I'm getting a tax rebate, and at the same time the government is running up debt. When the government runs up debt, that means that's debt we've got to pay interest on, and money which at some point we're going to have to pay back. This, they say, is like me drawing out some money on my plastic, on my charge card, and thinking I've got something in my pocket that's a big benefit for me and I can just go spend it. The day of reckoning comes, they know, and at high interest rates. There are enough Nova Scotians out there who look at that situation and they say, wait a minute, you're paying for this tax cut on plastic. That doesn't make any sense, they say. It just doesn't make any sense. It makes no economic sense. How can you do that? And do you expect us to be fooled? You expect us to take these checks knowing that you're running up the debt to do it and to feel grateful? I've had conversations like that with people. They look at it and they see it for what it is. Now, the word bribe has been used to describe this. An attempt at catching votes is another way of thinking about it. But the public looks at it from a variety of different perspectives, and they understand it for what it is, and they don't like it. It's no wonder that the government hasn't gotten the bounce in the polls that they expected to get from this. How could they think, how could they possibly think that anyone was going to buy into this when there are so many reasonable ways to look at it and understand it as a worse than worthless exercise? The only rational conclusion is that it's damaging to the Nova Scotia provincial economy. And that is the conclusion that most Nova Scotians have come to. Certainly is what the commentators have been saying in the press. It's what opinion leaders say. And you know what? It doesn't require someone to be an economist to figure it out. It doesn't require someone to be active in politics to figure it out. I had a fascinating conversation with a local business person who initiated the conversation with me on this subject recently. He pointed out that in general he doesn't pay a lot of attention to politics. Like many Nova Scotians, he said, he votes, but he makes up his mind after discussion with his spouse about how his vote should be cast. He doesn't see himself as aligned to any particular party. He thinks about it when the election time comes, discusses it, sees what's of importance to him, to his family, looks at the positions, maybe by a week or two before poll time, he's made up his mind. But he looked at it, and this was shortly after the budget announcement, and he said, I haven't decided yet what I'm going to do, but I'm certainly not going to be voting for this government. How could, and he said, I do well. I do well in my business. I make lots of money. And a 10% tax cut, to jump ahead, he said, might benefit me more than many other people. But he said, when I look at that check for $155 that's going to be coming to me, I'm insulted. He said, they're running up the debt to do it. That doesn't make any sense. And I can see that it's being done to try to fool people into voting for them, and I don't like that. Well, I hope the members opposite are listening to what I'm saying on this point. It hasn't worked. It just plain hasn't worked. Because people look at it, they see it for what it is, and they reject it. They are, like the gentleman I mentioned, insulted. Well, let's look at the other part of it, the 10% tax cut. What should people think about that? What do Nova Scotians think about it? Is this any better for people? Is it going to have a positive impact on the economy? Can we afford it? Is it the right thing to do? Now, Nova Scotians are asking themselves that kind of question. The only question the government is asking themselves about it is, will it be attractive enough for voters this summer? But Nova Scotians are asking themselves something different. They're saying to themselves, a 10% tax cut, what should I think about that? Well, it's very similar to the question of the $155 check. First, half of the adults in the province don't qualify in the first place because they make such low incomes, they don't have to pay provincial income tax. Same situation. And if you don't pay provincial income tax, if there's a 10% tax cut, it doesn't matter to you. 10% off of zero is still zero, doesn't matter. You may recall that in question period, we introduced the statistics for the residents of the home constituencies of the Premier and the Minister of Finance. More than 50% of the people who live in those constituencies are low-income people who won't be paying income tax. That means that if they get a 10% tax cut on their income tax, it doesn't matter to them because they're not paying any tax. So right away, there are a large number of people to whom this doesn't matter. Now, what about the rest of them? What do the rest of them think? Now, I'm sure that there are people out there who are big fans of a tax cut. And the people who are big fans of a tax cut are those very few Nova Scotians who make such large incomes that it's going to be a sizable reduction in their income tax for them. Although, as I pointed out earlier, there are those Nova Scotians who earn a pretty good penny who still feel so insulted by the $155 check that their votes are not secure for that reason. What I'll point out to the government is that there may be some Nova Scotians who are so wealthy that they will appreciate the tax cut, but you know what? I bet it isn't going to determine their votes. I bet they'll decide on all kinds of other grounds how they're going to vote. And I bet that one of the things that those people are sophisticated enough to understand is that this is probably not a good idea for the province as a whole. Now, why is that? Why is it that this is not generally good for the province as a whole? Well, for one thing, we probably can't afford it. But for another, it's what's called a flat tax cut. Normally, when one hears the phrase flat tax is the idea that no matter what your income, you pay the same percentage of your income as your tax. It's called a flat tax. often the kind of percentage one hears is something like 15%. It is sometimes suggested that this is a fair form of income taxation. I completely disagree. It absolutely is not. Taxation, income taxation in Canada has been what's called progressive for very good reasons. What that means is the more you earn, the more you pay as a percentage of your income, and that makes sense. But this is a flat tax cut. What it means is that even if you pay the smallest amount of provincial income tax, assume that you're not one of those 50% of the adults who are so low in the income scale that you don't pay it. Suppose you're just over the line, or you're one of the next 10 or 20% of the population who makes a living wage, enough to support yourself perhaps and your family in very modest circumstances. There are thousands of Nova Scotians out there like that. And they look at that and they say, well, I don't pay a lot in provincial income tax. Maybe I pay $500, something like that, maybe $1,000 at the most. Well, maybe I'll have to pay $50 or $100 less. They'll look at it. But then, for the person who pays $20,000 in tax to the province of Nova Scotia, for them it's $2,000 reduction because it's a flat tax. It's 10% for everybody. It isn't a bigger tax cut for the people at the lower end. It isn't a set dollar amount. It isn't a small amount or none for people at the high end. It's an even across-the-board reduction. That's called a flat tax, or in this case, a flat tax cut. So people look at that and they think, well, this is unfair. This isn't the way the tax system ought to be. Tax system, when it comes to income taxes, should be progressive, meaning you still pay a lot more at the top end rather than at the lower end. So people look at that and they know that it's unfair. But you know what? They know something else as well. They know that if the people in modest circumstances had more of the money in their own pockets, they would probably spend it locally, and it would probably be more of a stimulus to the economy than money in the hands of people at the higher end when we're talking about this amount of money. Remember, it's $68 million. $68 million that might flow through the provincial economy. Now, might is the operative word. Is that money going to flow through the provincial economy? If most of that money were in the hands, if we were going to go ahead with a tax cut, if that were going to happen, if most of the money were in the hands of people in modest circumstances, they would buy locally. People who are at the higher end of the income tax scale are probably going to be much more tempted to take that money and go on vacation somewhere warm. Come next winter, they're looking for something to do. If they think they're going to save, they've got a savings of a couple of $1,000s, it'll probably subsidize a vacation out of the country. Or it might go towards buying some furniture. Might go towards buying some imported foods. There are a variety of predictable expenditures by those who are at the higher end of the income tax scale that allow them to spend that money in a way that is likely to have minimal positive impact in the local economy and maximum positive positive benefit on someone else's economy. But for people at the lower end, they spend their money locally. They go to the local corner stores. Their purchases are modest and made locally. They deal with local tradespeople. If they have to buy something for their home, they're buying it locally. They're probably not traveling abroad. They're probably not buying imported antiques. They're probably not buying imported wines. They're probably not going off somewhere else to spend their money. They spend their money locally. So that's the other thing that's wrong with it, and people understand that. They look at it and they know this. They think it is not only unfair, they understand that it is going to have minimum positive impact on the local economy. Certainly it's been oversold. Certainly it's been oversold. The kinds of measures we see in clauses 15 and 17 of this bill are just not going to have that kind of positive, beneficial impact that the government has been suggesting to us all along. And Nova Scotians seem to understand that. It's not hard to figure out. But you know what? It gets worse for the government. All of this is just technical matter. Certainly everyone understands it. Nova Scotians understand it. But they understand something else as well. They understand that $155 checks, that a 10% cut in income tax isn't really what they need. That isn't what they're looking for from their governments. It isn't the deal. It isn't what government is all about from their perspective. Now, here is the deal. The deal that appeals to Nova Scotians is that they pay their taxes and they get good services from their government in return. That's the deal. The Tory deal is we don't want to give you services from your government, and when you get good and fed up with not getting services from your government and we offer a tax cut, you're going to be grateful. That is not a good deal. That is not the deal that Nova Scotians like, and it's not the deal that Nova Scotians are going to be interested in getting from their government. When Nova Scotians think about what they want, they think about solid pocketbook issues, of which income tax cuts are not top of the list, if they're even on the list at all. Nova Scotians look at the things that they have to spend money on, and they say to themselves, why isn't my government doing something about this? Nova Scotians look at tuition fees for post-secondary education, and they say, why are tuition fees in Nova Scotia the highest in the country? I can't afford to send my children to the local university or community college. And Nova Scotians are very interested in getting post-secondary education. Unfortunately, all too often, they get their education, we get our education, and go off down the road to some other province. But Nova Scotians are very interested in education. They know that the way forward for them, for their children, for their families, is to get as much education as they can absorb. But that is the way forward economically. And that a person, a family, that does not maximize its opportunities for education is going to miss out and be left behind in the modern world. This is changing. It's changing to the point where it's overwhelming anyone who doesn't have good education qualifications. And it's just going to continue that way, we know. And Nova Scotians know that. So they look at it and they say, why isn't my government doing something about that? If the government has so much money, if they think that they can send out rebate checks for $68 million, and if they think that they can implement and institutionalize a 10% tax cut, why don't they spend the money on something useful instead? Why don't they do something about tuition fees? So my children can go to university, can go to community college at a price we can afford. That's higher up on the list than a tax cut for people in Nova Scotia. They look at that and they know that something should be done about that. They look at something else. They look at an item that we raised with respect to a very peculiar anomaly in the healthcare system last fall. We identified the fact that people in long-term care have to pay for their own health care. And we identified the fact that these seniors, unique among Nova Scotians of any age, have to pay for their health care because they happen to be living in a long-term care situation. And the reaction to that was universal. The editorials were clear, the public was clear, the 12 or 18,000 name petition that came to this House was clear. Nova Scotians looked at this and they said, this is wrong. This is unfair. It's a peculiar anomaly. It just shouldn't be. And why is my government, a government that said it was trying to appeal particularly to seniors, why are they treating us this way? And Nova Scotians see that item as a lot higher up the list than a tax cut. And the government costed it out and they said, well, it'd be $30 million to do this, and we're not going to do it. We're going to make some minor changes, but we're really not going to do it. We'd rather give you a tax cut. And Nova Scotians look at it and they say, well, wait a minute, if you can afford a tax cut, if you can afford to send out these checks, why can't you afford to fund the health care costs of people who are in long-term care? If the money's there, why aren't you doing it? Because it's much higher up my list of priorities, Nova Scotians say, than a tax cut. That's the deal, they say. We're supposed to be paying taxes. You're supposed to be giving us services, the kinds of things that we come to expect. We didn't think we elected Republicans, they said. Republicans in the United States are people who believe that government doesn't work, get themselves elected to demonstrate it. That's not what we voted for, they said. We didn't expect this. And Nova Scotians look at something else and they say, well, what about all these user fees that have been introduced? They say, as I understand it, government revenues have been going up for the last few years because of all the extra fees that have been going on. If you're going to cut something, they say, what about cutting all these user fees instead of income tax? Or they can say, if you're going to cut something, what about the 15% tax that I pay on my home heating fuel? Why don't you cut that? Why don't you get rid of that? That's much higher up my list, they say, than a 10% cut in income tax. Nova Scotians understand this. This is a pocketbook issue. This is not hard to understand. They understand it. They know that they're still paying through the nose for sales taxes on essential items, and they don't like it. They remember the 1998 election. They remember that party that now forms the government, in common with our party, ran on a platform that said, take the HST off of home heating fuel, off of electricity, off of necessities. That was part of the campaign at the time. What happened to that promise? For a government that vaunts itself as having made 260 promises and kept all kinds of them, what happened to that one? Seems to have fallen off the list. Instead, Nova Scotians see that they're being offered a tax cut, but that's not on their list of priorities. On their list of priorities would be to do something about sales taxes, not income taxes. Sales taxes are the kinds of things that people run into day after day after day on necessities of life. And because the amount is the same, because it's the same 15%, it means when the richest of Nova Scotians go and have their oil tanks filled, they're paying the same 15% as the most modest of Nova Scotians. And Nova Scotians look at that and they say, that's not fair. That's not right. Take it off of my necessities. Take that tax off of my necessity. Make life just a little bit easier for me in that respect, in something that matters to me in my day-to-day life. Don't try to make me think that it matters if there's a $155 check floating out there for some people, or you reduce income taxes for some people. They look at it and they say, this doesn't matter to me. What would matter to me, what would make life easier, what is higher up my list of priorities would be to take those sales taxes off of necessities. Now, Nova Scotians have other priorities. There are other pocketbook issues out there that are higher up the list. If they want their government to be doing something, they'll look at their automobile insurance rates that are going up enormously. That's another pocketbook item. And you know what? It's not even really a government revenue item. They could be doing that. People could look to their government and say, if you really wanted to do something for me, why aren't you coming in with a big cut in the premiums that I pay for automobile insurance? I'd rather see you put your effort into that, they say, instead of coming in with all this fancy stuff that has virtually no effect on my life. I'm having trouble making ends meet, they're saying. And this isn't really going to help me. And they look at their property taxes. Their property taxes continue to rise, not necessarily because the municipal councils have been putting the rates up, but because there's been an increase in property values. And it's been quite dramatic. Certainly everyone in HRM knows this. There's been an enormous increase in the value of properties in HRM over the last 4 to 5 years. It's been enormous. And although the tax rates have been more or less stable, the rate is then multiplied by the dollar value, the market value of the home. And the amount of property taxes that are being paid to the municipality has been going up enormously. And this is a big concern to people. And they're saying to the province, can you do something about this? And you know what? The answer is the province could be doing things about this. For example, a portion of the money that is paid in property taxes goes to support school education. There's a mandatory component of the property tax that the province demands that municipalities turn over to them to help support education at the school level in this province. And yet municipalities, of course, have absolutely no jurisdiction over schools. They don't hire teachers. They don't build the schools. They don't pay the teachers. They don't design the curriculum. They can't change the curriculum. They've got nothing to say about French immersion. It's not a municipal matter. And yet, there is a portion of property taxes that are essentially a flow-through item. Now, what would happen if the province were to follow what the Union of Nova Scotia Municipalities has been saying to them for years? Province, you should be paying for schools 100% out of general provincial revenues. Now, they said, we know this is a lot of money, but you can phase it in over 10 years. Why don't you do that, the Union of Nova Scotia Municipalities says. And let's remember who the Union of Nova Scotia Municipalities is. That's the organization that is made up of the municipal councils of every municipality in this province. They're the local people who know what the local concerns are. And they're saying, in effect, that if the province were to take that over, it would take some of the load off of the property taxpayer. They'd be able to offer better services locally. They'd be able to offer better sidewalks, better sewage treatment plants, good water treatment. They'd be able to do the kind of local things that municipalities do. They'd have more money to be able to do that and wouldn't have to put up their taxes to do it, if only the province would take that over. And yet the province is sitting here saying, well, we know the Union of Municipalities wants this, but we'd much rather offer a tax cut to people. But you know what? Instead of offering the tax cut, which isn't a high priority with people, they could relieve the municipalities and therefore relieve the property taxpayer of the weight of $100 million that they pay towards the cost of schooling. That would be fair. It would be the right thing to do. It's where the responsibility lies. It should be with the province. I think there's probably even been some acknowledgement on the part of the government, many governments, that that's probably right. And 10-year phase-in. Is that a problem? That isn't a problem. How could that be a problem? But do we hear the government saying this? No. This might matter more to people in their day-to-day lives because they'd pay less in their property taxes, or they would get more in municipal services. But no, the government wants to come through big spenders, the big spenders. They want to come through with what they think is going to be welcomed by the voters of Nova Scotia, another tax cut. It's wrong, it's nonsense. Now, what should be done about tax? I think I've mentioned enough in the way of individual examples to remind members that there are serious problems with our tax system in Nova Scotia. Now, I don't think that there's ever really been an examination of the tax system in Nova Scotia from stem to stern. Tax is something that you really don't want to tinker with very much without looking at the full implications of what you're doing. You don't want to tinker with the structure for municipal taxation without thinking how this might have impact on sales taxes or on income taxes or on other forms of tax like excise taxes. There needs to be a thoroughgoing review of our tax system. We've said this for years. We've said that the model for it is the Ontario Fair Tax Commission, held back in 1993. And we promised in 1998 that if we were elected to government, there would be a thorough review of the tax system. Probably doesn't have to be a royal commission, but that there should be a thoroughgoing public consultation review of all aspects of the tax system. What do we do with casinos? What do we do with Nova Scotia Power and how it pays its taxes? What about the utility corridors that have been put down for the natural gas pipelines? What about our relations with First Nations people? What about this disentanglement of provincial and municipal responsibilities and what they pay for tax? Is there something different that should be done with respect to property taxation in the municipalities? Do they need different sorts of revenue generating devices? Should there be something done about one of those favorites that we often hear from the Chamber of Commerce, the business occupancy tax? There is no shortage of significant, serious tax questions that probably should be examined in a public forum, in an interactive dialogue with the full public, the full informed public. And believe me, when it comes to taxation, the public is informed and they have opinions about what is fundamentally fair. They wouldn't be shy about speaking up. And that's what we promised. What we promised is a thoroughgoing review of the tax system. Now, HST agreement with the federal government should certainly be on the table for re-examination in all its details. All of these things need to be looked at, and this is the rational thing to do about taxes, not what Bill 36 offers us. Bill 36 fails on all counts to appeal to the people of Nova Scotia because it does the wrong things. It does things that fail to benefit fully half the people. It does things that benefit many people in minute ways. It does things that benefit people who do benefit unfairly. And it's the wrong sense of priorities when it comes to taxation because there are other economic things that people are worried about in Nova Scotia. And it's not going to have an economic stimulus. Let's be clear about that. It, in fact, even runs the risk of putting us in a deficit position again. Something I think all parties are agreed is a very undesirable matter. Well, Mr. Chair, I think the result is fairly clear. The result is that there is very little in this bill that is appealing. There is very little that is appealing to us in the opposition, and more importantly, there is very little in this bill, the check, the tax cut, that is actually appealing to voters out there. They've seen through it. They've seen it for what it is. They don't want it. And I say, let's finish with this bill soon. Let's finish with this legislative session soon. Let's get on with the election, and let's find out in detail how much they don't want it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I recognize the member from Richmond.
Thank you, Speaker. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to make a few comments on Bill number 36, Financial Measures Act 2003. Speaker, what I've said before in a number of occasions I've had to speak on this is that this government will be recognized as a government of missed opportunities, a government whose hasn't acted on the opportunities provided to them. And talking about finances, Speaker, one of the issues which I feel is quite pertinent to speak at this point in dealing with some of the opportunities lost by this government over the last 4 years is one, for example, in our crab industry, Mr. Speaker. We all know that the quotas and the amount of landings of crab in Nova Scotia have grown exponentially in the last number of years, which has created a great deal of employment on fishing vessels, which has helped spur the economy of local communities in the requirement for fuel, requirement for food, requirement for rice, bait, etc., and the employment of crew members. Mr. Speaker, one of the main concerns is the fact that a great deal of the resource that is being landed on our shores here in Nova Scotia is not being processed here in this province. Now, Mr. Speaker, is that because we do not have the capacity to process that? Is it because we do not have the interest in processing it? Is it because we don't have the workers who want to work in processing crab? No, Mr. Speaker. It is because we have a government that has sat by and allowed other provinces to put barriers against trade that have negatively impacted Nova Scotians, rather than stepping up to the plate and saying that they would put Nova Scotians first. And I have to tell you, Speaker, it was almost amusing to hear the Minister of Finance in his budget speech, or it's either in his budget speech or in the Premier's throne speech, where they referred to this Nova Scotia First brand. And one would ask, why have they not applied that to the crab industry, for example? And Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotia has a proud history of being open competitors. We encourage competition. We're pleased to have competition in this province. We believe that competition is the proper way to go. But, Mr. Speaker, when you have provinces that are putting up barriers that negatively impact us, we can no longer sit back as a province that says we want to grow our economy, that says we want to create more revenue here in this province, we want to put more people to work, if we're going to sit by idly and let other provinces take advantage of us, which is basically what has happened in the last 4 years. For example, Mr. Speaker, the province of Newfoundland and Labrador has a policy in place that has been there for a number of years that says that no raw fish is to leave the province of Newfoundland unprocessed if there's an ability to process it in Newfoundland. What that means is that buyers from Nova Scotia are not permitted to go to Newfoundland. No, I shouldn't go that far, but Newfoundland processors and buyers are not permitted to send product across the ferry to Nova Scotia for processing. Even further than that, Mr. Speaker, what the province of Newfoundland and Labrador has said is that they will limit who can actually get a buyer's permit in Newfoundland. And in fact, I believe there's a requirement that you have to be a resident of Newfoundland in order to get that buyer's permit. What that does is it prevents any buyer from Nova Scotia from going to Newfoundland and to purchase crab and to bring it back to Nova Scotia for processing. Now, what do we do here in this province? Mr. Speaker, as I said, we are open competitors. But what that has allowed is it has allowed buyers from Newfoundland to come here, obtain buying permits from this government, buy the crab on our shore, and truck it over to Newfoundland for processing. Now, Mr. Speaker, if we're going to grow this economy, if we're going to put more people at work, if we're going to have a Nova Scotia First brand, when are we going to put an end to this practice? And tell Newfoundland that we believe in open competition, but if you're not going to remove these barriers, we are going to take serious action against you. Mr. Speaker, that is, again, a lost opportunity that this government's been sitting by. And I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, you've seen yourself some of the news reports last year where workers were stopping the trucks at the ferry terminal in North Sydney saying, this is our raw product going to Newfoundland for processing to employ people in those facilities. Now, Mr. Speaker, I know that the previous Minister of Fisheries had put together an advisory group to deal with this, but at the end of the day, it is going to take the Minister to take some concrete action. Now, I believe I did see some release the other day from Greg Roach, I believe, from the Minister's Department, that did indicate that some sort of conditions would be put on the conditions for the permits, the buyer's permits this year. Now, Speaker, I'm anxious to see if that's going to be the case. I believe there was some sort of indication that it would put a requirement that any crab purchased here by buyers licensed by this province would remain here to be processed. Now, I'm not sure if that's exactly the case, and I look forward to getting more information on that. Mr. Speaker, that is one example that I can tell you would provide a great deal of employment for communities such as my own in Richmond, Shetty Camp, down in Glace Bay, Louisbourg, North Sydney, Neils Harbour, Mulgrave is another area, and Canso, for example. All areas that could significantly benefit if we were to have the crab caught off the shores of Nova Scotia processed in this province. What would that do for those communities, Mr. Speaker? What would that do in growing the economy of this province? I would submit to you, if we could have every pound of crab landed in this province processed in Nova Scotia, that in itself would be a significant economic stimulus for those communities that I assure you can use it. Mr. Speaker, in order to do that, we must, as a province, be willing to stand up for the unfair trade practices being used by other provinces which negatively impact our industry. And Mr. Speaker, it's a fine line to draw because we do want to make sure that our fishermen can get the best price possible, and at the same time we want to make sure that we can create as many jobs. That is why I say in Bill number 36 it is lost opportunities by this government to grow the economy. That's just one example, Mr. Speaker. That's not going out and the government having to throw a bunch of money and hope that there'll be a return on it. That is our own raw product that is coming to our shores, that the government, if it took action, could use that as an advantage to stimulate the economy in those communities. So it really doesn't require them to spend any money at all. But they need to make sure that they're willing to stand up for the province in protecting us against unfair trade practices. Mr. Speaker, you see in other provinces with softwood lumber and how they are fighting to try to protect their industry, and I just question why the government won't do the same here in protecting that, which will benefit, as I said, the communities such as Canso, Mulgrave, Ilmadam area, Louisbourg, Glace Bay, Neils Harbour, Shetty Camp, and areas throughout Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, that's but one example. One of the other things that this government has done, Mr. Speaker, I can tell you, that I say is lost opportunities, is they have completely turned their backs on the small business of this province. I asked the minister the other day, now, Mr. Speaker, like you, like so many other members here, we get constituents who come in and say, look, I have a business idea, either to start a new business, or we get existing business people that will come in and say, look, I have an idea to expand. Now, Mr. Speaker, they're not coming in saying, I want to create 100 jobs, or I want to create 200 jobs, or even 50 jobs. It's to create maybe 2 jobs, 5 jobs, 10 jobs, maybe 20 jobs. Mr. Speaker, small business is the heartbeat of the economy of Nova Scotia. We do have very large industries that we're proud of, but at the end of the day, when one looks at where the majority of Nova Scotians are employed, it is through small businesses. Yet, Mr. Speaker, time and time again, when I would write to the Minister of Economic Development and say, what assistance could you possibly provide to this individual, either with their new business idea or with their expansion, time and time again, the response has come back from this government saying, there's absolutely nothing we can do. Mr. Speaker, it's to the point where I now question why we have some of the employees of the Department of Economic Development in different communities when they don't have a budget that they can even operate from. I can show you time and time again, I always knew what response I was going to get from the local representative in the Strait area. It was to say, great idea, sounds good, there's nothing for us. There's nothing we can do to help. Mr. Speaker, it is important to know that Nova Scotia Business Incorporated, which was put together by this government where they said this was going to be used to stimulate the economy, to grow our revenues, they are not interested in small business. That is not their mandate. If you're not 50 jobs or more that you look to create, they're not interested in talking to you. Now, Speaker, is this an accusation I make? Not at all. This was confirmed by the Minister of Economic Development in estimates, where I asked, if I have a small businessman who wants to create a new enterprise or expand, what assistance can your government provide, and what can I tell them that your government and your department will do? And the answer came back, nothing. We currently do not have any current programs to deal with small businesses in this province. Mr. Speaker, that's why I say that Bill number 36, like so many other bills brought forward by this government, is lost opportunities. The government continues to look for the pie in the sky when it comes to economic development. Now, one can only hope that they will all be successful, but it's not always the case. And every government in this province has seen some failures in that, and that is very unfortunate. It's very unfortunate that we cannot claim that every investment made has been a success. Many of them have. But why are we not working with the small business community to help them grow, to help them be sustainable, to help them put that little expansion on? Because at the end of the day, they are the heartbeat of our economy. They are the heartbeat of rural Nova Scotia, especially, Mr. Speaker. And that's why, again, in this budget, the question is, where is the incentives to assist these small businesses? Where is the incentive from the government to say, look, we are putting together a plan where we are going to work with these businesses. We're going to work to help them be able to put capital together and be able to have the money necessary to make the investments that they are looking to make. That is another example, Mr. Speaker, of the lost opportunities by this government. And those small business operators, they're not cheering because of this $155 check. They're not cheering because of the 10% tax cut the other day. Speaker, I want to tell you, for example, when we had law amendments, Luke Urjevec came before us, Food and Restaurant Association, and he said how many members, and he said, and we represent 20,000 Nova Scotians that work in the industry. So I asked him, well, you said you represent them. Do they have a vote in your association? Oh, well, no. Only the owners have a vote. So I said, you don't represent the workers then? You haven't been voted in, or they don't pay. Well, not really. Okay. And in his statement, he said how happy the workers were that they were going to get the $155 check and the 10% tax cut. I said, that's an interesting statement, Sir Urjevec. I said, could you indicate to us what percentage or what amount of the 20,000 employees in the food service industry are going to receive the check?
Did he know?
He didn't know the answer. How many are going to benefit from the 10% tax cut? Didn't know that either. But I can tell you, I think that's one industry, for example, where many of them think they're getting the check, and many think they're going to benefit from the 10% that aren't, because of the nature of the work they do, because of the nature of the salaries they make, the hours that they have to work. Many are part-time. So when you ask further questions, Mr. Speaker, you clearly see that it's not as rosy as what this government would have us believe. And Nova Scotians are saying, $1 billion later, $1 billion that has been taken out of our pockets, basically, under this government in 4 years. And yet, at the end of the day, with an extra $1 billion in revenue, the Minister of Finance stands and he says, look, we're now in a position where I can put money back into the pockets of Nova Scotians. $68 million, because the budget is balanced, all is well. Well, Speaker, when we start asking a few more questions, we clearly see all is not well. It might be well in the Tory world, but it's not well in the real world. Because what does the minister say? First, we know that he's borrowed approximately $500 million since 1999 on top of his yearly revenues, which is added directly to the debt of this province, as you well know. And then this year, when he tells us that he's in a position to give money back to Nova Scotians, when asked, he tells us he proposes to borrow another $118 million and add that to the debt. No, Mr. Speaker, I think if this government did not have effective opposition parties, they might have gotten away with it. They might have been able to convince Nova Scotians with the balanced budget, everything is well, we can put money, we can send money back out in the middle of an election campaign, but pay no attention to that. But our message, and our message as a caucus, the Liberal caucus, has been quite clear over the years that we need to pay attention to the debt. Saying that you're going to balance a budget is not the answer to all of the financial problems we have. It's but one step. But you have to keep in mind where the debt of this province is. Now, Mr. Speaker, I can tell you that when they talk about finances in this province, the media and others, they refer to the size of our debt. They refer to the concerns that we have about our debt, and that this government has not been able to use their spin doctors in convincing Nova Scotians that balancing the budget is going to make everything fine. Mr. Speaker, I tell you again that Nova Scotians have grown up, and one of the things we pride ourselves in Nova Scotia is that we were raised with the belief that you pay what you owe. that you pay off your house, that you pay off your car, that you pay off your loans, that you pay your grocery bills, that you pay your oil bills, and that you do not leave. When you leave this world, that you do not say, I look forward to leaving my estate in a deficit position. I look forward to leaving my children with my debt to pay because, I just didn't want to pay it while I was living, and they'll be in a better position to do so when they grow up. None of us were raised on those principles, Mr. Speaker, and that's why today Nova Scotians are saying, why should we expect that from our government? $1 billion in additional revenue, and yet they're still borrowing. And in 1999, Mr. Speaker, as you well know, the Blue Book, the first page, where the Premier said, my government will live within its means. He said that in 1999 when the total revenues of this province were $4.6 billion a year. He said he'd live within his means. 4 years later, when the revenues are $5.6 billion a year, he still anticipates borrowing $118 million. Yet, Mr. Speaker, one can ask, well, okay, maybe it's going to stop after that. But it doesn't. He's now indicated that he wants to borrow till 2013. Mr. Speaker, how can one argue that that is a legitimate plan that Nova Scotians should accept? $500 million is what they have added. Now, Speaker, if the member from Yarmouth wishes to stand in his place rather than clucking like a chicken back there, let him stand in his place and say something here in this House. But, Mr. Speaker, I assure you, he will continue his clucking and his name-calling back there, and, being the miscongeniality of Province House, he'll continue on his ways that we've all become accustomed to. Mr. Speaker, as I said, Mr. Speaker, as I was saying, Mr. Speaker, that, Mr. Speaker, at the end of the day, 2013 is how long the government intends to continue borrowing. Now, all of a sudden, when the reaction came from Nova Scotians, the alarm at the thought that they would continue to borrow for another 10 years, the government has now come out and said, we are going to bring forward a debt management plan that will reduce that. So, Mr. Speaker, we asked clearly, when was this plan conceived, or when was this plan requested? And Mr. Speaker, when we had the Deputy Minister of Finance come before Public Accounts, and he was asked, I think that was a couple of weeks ago, and he was asked, when will this plan come forward? Mr. Speaker, the Deputy Minister indicated that the request for that plan had been made a few weeks earlier. So clearly, Mr. Speaker, is this plan a long-term long-term vision that this government has had over the last few years as to where they want it to go? Not at all. It is a realization that Nova Scotians were not buying their spin doctoring, that a balanced budget was all that would be required for this province. It is now their recognition that the debt is a serious issue for Nova Scotians, and they must give the appearance of wanting to do something for the debt of this province. Mr. Speaker, once again, will this be a real plan, a plan that will actually deal with the issues that Nova Scotians face today in the debt? No, Mr. Speaker. This will once again be something that will be conceived by spin doctors and put together to try to convince Nova Scotians that this government is actually do something when in effect little or nothing is being done on the debt of this province. Mr. Speaker, I can tell you that especially the constituents in my area, when you're asked what is your priority, is it the $155 check, which many of them will not be receiving? Is it the 10% tax cut, which once again many of them will not be benefiting from? They're clearly saying, how can you be saying that this is...
Order. Order. The member from Richmond has the floor. If there are members who would wish to carry on conversations, I suggest they do it outside the chamber. I know it's been a long day, but there's only 23 minutes left in this session, so I wish you would give the your attention to the member from Richmond. He has the floor.
Thank you, Speaker. And again, when they're being asked, how can you justify giving a $155 check and a 10% tax cut at a time when you're continuing to borrow money? And we've made it quite clear. Tax cuts are an appropriate measure at the appropriate time, but they're certainly not an appropriate measure when you're continuing to go out and add to a debt which is currently, I believe, the highest debt per capita of any other province in this country. Mr. Speaker, we're not in a normal situation compared to other provinces when it comes to that. We are in a situation that, while it has not been deemed a crisis yet, I would submit to you, if there is not some control put in place that we may actually get to that point before long. What my constituents are telling me, Mr. Speaker, is that they want to see attention being paid to the roads of Richmond County and to the roads throughout this province. Because, Mr. Speaker, this is clearly a government that has abandoned the commitments they made to addressing roads throughout this province. I would submit to you, especially rural roads throughout constituencies around this province. Mr. Speaker, in 4 years, there has not been any major or significant amount of paving that has taken place on the rural roads in Richmond County. There was some work done on route number 4 between Port Hawkesbury and St. Peter's, and again some work done from St. Peter's going towards Irish Cove onto number 4. But as far as the communities on Ilmadam, whether it be Arishat, whether it be Rocky Bay, whether it be in the Loosedale community, whether it be in Whiteside, whether it be in the Dundee area, Roberta, the Points, whether it be in River Bourgeois, the number 4, which has been the #1 priority of the district office for the last number of years, or in the communities of Lardwez, Loch Lomond, surrounding areas. That is where the people of Richmond County are saying they would like to see their tax dollars spent, so that when they take a drive to the drugstore, when they take a drive to go see the doctor, or they take a drive out to go visit the different people in the county, or to enjoy the beauty of Richmond County, they want to be able to do so without continually having to cross the yellow line, having to swerve to avoid potholes, and having to sustain significant damage to their vehicles. Mr. Speaker, more and more what we are hearing under the 4 years of this Tory government is where seniors are telling us that they have never seen the roads in the situation that they are in right now, the neglectful state that they are in. Mr. Speaker, I would submit to you that that is not only Richmond County, but that is something that is being said throughout this entire province, and I can assure you that it will be a significant issue in the upcoming provincial election. Because, Mr. Speaker, this is a government that in the 1999 Blue Book said that all revenue that is raised from gas tax, oil tax, license renewal, vehicle registration, all of that money will go towards road construction and maintenance. Mr. Speaker, 4 years later, sorry to use this analogy, but they're not a country mile close to having kept that commitment. And now they don't even talk about it anymore. It's completely off their radar screen. They don't mention it once. I remember the member from Colchester, Muscatawbet Valley saying what a wonderful thing it was, and that his government would be able to hold that commitment, and that they'd be able to do the road construction necessary. That hasn't taken place. He doesn't even talk about it anymore, Mr. Speaker. He doesn't even mention roads anymore. That member used to talk about truckers all the time. We don't hear that being mentioned anymore. So, Mr. Speaker, once again, as I said, this is lost opportunities by a government which after 4 years has clearly not been able to get the pulse of Nova Scotians as to what their priorities are, as to where they want to see their tax dollars spent, as to how they want to see their government prioritize the different areas funding that is required. Now, Speaker, what this government will shoot back and say, well, look, are you trying to say we shouldn't have made more investments in healthcare? Not at all. But what I would answer to that is that in 1999, John Hamm said $1.5 billion is enough for healthcare. Healthcare doesn't need more money, it needs better management. It needs a cut in the administrative fat. That's what he said. Too many bureaucrats in the minister's office, too many bureaucrats in the system. Mr. Speaker, they have not eliminated bureaucrats, they've added them. There are more now than there was before. Now they continue to spend more money. Healthcare spending has gone from $1.5 billion to now $2.1 billion. Now, Mr. Speaker, you know, at what point are we going to get control over spending in healthcare, or are we just going to continue to throw more and more money in it and have the government thump its chest and say, oh, well, we care about healthcare because we're throwing more money into it? Mr. Speaker, has the system improved? There has been some improvements. I don't think it would be responsible to stand here and say nothing has improved. I think there has been. One of the areas, there's a lot more medical equipment than there was. There's been new equipment bought. But, Mr. Speaker, keep in mind that the vast majority of that money, in some cases 100% of that money, has come from Ottawa. It has not come from this province. So Add on top of that the money that came from Ottawa, plus the fact that they've now reached $2.1 billion for healthcare, one has to ask, at what point does it end? Will they continually, year after year, be coming in and saying we're going to put more money in healthcare and try to convince Nova Scotians that that's a great thing? Mr. Speaker, as I said, healthcare needs better management. It needs some control. And this is the Premier who told us. It's not ourselves that are accusing him of saying something he didn't say. He's the guy who said, I will fix healthcare if you elect me. I will better manage healthcare, and I only need $1.5 billion to do so. When the Minister of Health was asked during estimates, after 4 years, you've increased spending to $2.1 billion. Is healthcare fixed? Nope. As you promised. I asked her, I believe, 10 times. Gave her lots of chances to answer the question. She refused to answer. She kept saying, I think she said there's been improvements to the healthcare system. Now, Mr. Speaker, I read through the Blue Book, and I did my best to try to find where it says in the Blue Book that they would improve healthcare.
Nope. Fix it.
I couldn't find it anywhere, Mr. Speaker. Why? Because they said they would fix healthcare. Then we can all go again to the postcard used by the Minister of Education. I can tell you we're all very curious to see what postcard she'll be using in this campaign. If it's as accurate as the postcard she had the last time, where she said close Cisco and open hospital beds, but we've all seen not only was there no hospital beds open, she wasn't able to keep open the ones that were there when she was first elected. Again, Mr. Speaker, when Cisco's closed, those people are out of work. And they wonder why the economy hasn't been able to improve, because they've been big on closing businesses. The question is, they haven't been so big on supporting small business or other avenues to grow our economy. And again, I give you the example of the crab industry, of a lost opportunity by this government to be able to get control over the opportunities to have more processing jobs here in this province, and the opportunity for this province to better get the advantages of that industry, for example. Speaker, this budget, in effect, completely turns a blind eye to the seniors of this province. Speaker, you'll know with Bill 36 and its attempts to put together the $155 check and a 10% tax cut, we all know that the vast majority of seniors, I can tell you especially in my area, will not be receiving the $155 check, nor will they be getting the 10% tax cut. Yet, what have they been asked to do? You know, basically, by not getting the $155 check or not getting the 10% check, the Minister of Finance has said, look, we're only giving it to those who paid provincial income tax. If you didn't pay provincial income tax, you didn't help grow the economy, and why should we be sending you money? That's the rationale. Yeah. It's basically saying those who are not getting the check, it's because you're not good enough and you haven't really helped the system. You know, really, maybe you were actually a drain on the system in the view of the Tory eyes, and you're kind of overall a burden to us. That's the Tory view. And that goes back, you look when they were first elected, who's the first department they went after, and the first group they went after? People who receive community service benefits. Right. First group, first target group they had that they went in. Fortunately, Mr. Speaker, at some point they realized that they were going too far, and they did pull back, because I would submit to you they were planning on going at that department much harder. And I would submit to you, Mr. Speaker, if this government was given a second mandate, they will finish the job. They went so far in this mandate. If they get the next mandate, look out for anyone who's on community services or disability pay here in this province. They'll finish the job. Transition houses, women's centers, we saw where they tried to go there. It was getting late in their mandate. They decided to pull back. I'd submit to you a second mandate. That's another target group that they'll go at immediately. So Bill 36, again, is a question about the priorities of this administration. Seniors, for example, who I've said are not going to be receiving the $155 check or benefit from the 10% tax cut for the most part, one has to ask, well, what have they contributed to the economy? Mr. Speaker, most of them have worked all their lives. They've raised their families.
Paid taxes.
They've paid taxes all along. They've helped grow the economy. Yet when asked today, are they no longer contributing to the economy? Not at all. Some of them pay property taxes. They pay insurance to insure their homes, which is taxed.
A lot of them volunteer.
They pay home heating oil costs, which is taxed. Those who have electric heat, that's also taxed. If they have a vehicle, they buy gas, which is taxed. which this government last year put a 2% hike on the cost, which brought them $25 million. Seniors contributed a significant amount of that. If they have a vehicle, if they're fortunate enough to have a vehicle, they pay insurance on that. Skyrocketing insurance under this administration, which is all taxed, which has brought this government last year, I believe, an additional $7 to $8 million in revenue. Seniors paid into that, yet they're being told by this government, you haven't contributed to the economy, you don't deserve to get a $155 check, or a 10% tax cut is absolutely going to be of no benefit to you. As I said before, Mr. Speaker, it's going to be interesting to see how Tory candidates do when they go to doorsteps of those individuals who either, because they're disabled, that they are unable to work, or are receiving community service benefits, or are seniors, or even single parents with a few children who earn less than $20,000. I want to see how they are going to rationalize to those individuals why they are not deserving, in the Tory view, to receive either $155 or benefit from the 10% tax cut.
Tell them then they don't deserve it.
That is what the real challenge is going to be. And as I said before, that is the aspect of Bill 36 the Minister of Finance never explained. He only kept telling the Tory caucus, look at all the people who will benefit and be happy of this. What he forgot to say is all the people who will not benefit. Yet, Mr. Speaker, seniors, as you know, are those who, for the most part, turn out in the highest numbers at election time to vote. I would submit to you, Mr. Speaker, that under that, there's probably going to be more voters who do not get the check than those who actually do get the check. Yet, this government has failed to keep that in mind. Mr. Speaker, you look at the 10% tax cut. One of the first groups that came out and said it was not the right thing to do was the Halifax Chamber of Commerce. Now, Mr. Speaker, here's a group, I believe they have 3,000 members. One would think that these businessmen and members of it would be the ones that would be so pleased to get a 10% income tax cut. Yet, Mr. Speaker, to show you again how this government has failed to get the pulse of Nova Scotians, here comes the Halifax Chamber of Commerce to say we fundamentally disagree with the government's decision to give a 10% tax cut or the $155 check. So when the Minister of Finance says that there's overwhelming support for tax cuts, it's just not the case. Here's a leading group that you would think would be the first to say that they support this, because one would think that they would be the ones that would take a significant advantage from this.
Normally he'd quote them.
Minister of Finance has quoted them in the past when it suited him. Now he won't even recognize the concerns that they have raised. To go even further, Mr. Speaker, the Chamber of Commerce started its own debt watch, where it's now passing a grade and reviewing and evaluating the government's actions on addressing the debt of this province. Now, Mr. Speaker, I think the Chamber of Commerce was trying to be not too critical in their first evaluation given to the minister, but they clearly raised the alarms and said that we're not putting in this debt watch because we think the government's doing great and it's not an issue. They're putting it in to try to put pressure on government to realize that balanced budgets are not the answer to the fiscal problems faced by this province. They are one of the measures taken. But if you're balancing a budget and still borrowing money, as has been said by the Dominion Bond Rating Service, you'll have an unadjusted deficit. That is the reality. I have spoken before. I know the member from Halifax Fairview has spoken before of how this government has played very loose with accounting rules in this province and has brought in the rules that best fitted their needs, not the fiscal needs of this province, but the political needs of this government. Mr. Speaker, as I speak here today is now May the 12th. We still do not have the results of the pensions, the public service pensions of this province. And I would submit to you, Mr. Speaker, that we will not be seeing those results while this House sits, because the government does not want Nova Scotians to see the exact status of those plans and to see the exact amount of underfunding that exists in those plans. Since December 31st, when the fiscal year ended, this government has been holding on to those numbers, not wanting to give them to us. Now, Mr. Speaker, one has to ask, by not giving the numbers, what could it possibly be that they don't want Nova Scotians to see? The Minister of Finance accuses us of raising concerns where there are none. A very simple way of addressing that, Mr. Speaker, is to put out the numbers. Let Nova Scotians see. Let the actuarials come out and say everything is fine. We're not concerned about the fact that the public service plan, for example, is almost $500 million underfunded as of November of last year, under this government's watch. Mr. Speaker, when we spoke at public accounts, it was asked about the investments made under this government's watch. And it was asked as to how those investments have performed. And the answer that did come back, Mr. Speaker, from the deputy, was that there was disappointment in the investments and that the investments had underachieved what was anticipated. Now, Mr. Speaker, I'm still waiting for the numbers from that public accounts session. We still have not been provided with that figure as to what the level of underachievement has been in those investments. And I would certainly hope that if anyone from the Department of Finance is still watching, that they will remind the Deputy of the commitments made to committee members to provide us with those figures and to provide us with the exact numbers as to the questions that he indicated that he would be able to provide to us. So, Mr. Speaker, I realize that my time this evening is starting to run a little short, but as I've said before, this is a budget that when I see the people of Richmond County, they're clearly saying, where is this government's priorities? Why are they not fixing our roads with their $68 million? Why are they not bringing in more doctors to Richmond County with their $68 million? Why is there not more nurses being hired or X-ray lab technicians for the St. Martha's Hospital, for example, with the $68 million? And why, rather than addressing those priorities, are they bending over backwards to accommodate the casino? Even at a time, as our leader put out in a press release, when the casinos themselves have said they don't really have a problem with the smoking exemption and they're not quite sure where this concern is coming from.
Political, it's politics.
They appear themselves to be alarmed as to why the government is reacting in the way it is, which begs the question, Mr. Speaker, is this really about sound public policy or is this about politics?
That's politics.
That is the question one has to ask, because, and why do I ask that? Because whenever the minister is asked, Mr. Finance or the Premier, they stand up and they keep hurling back at us that it is the former government that signed a casino contract, they're to blame for everything, and that no blame should be put on this government for not upholding the terms of that contract or putting the health and safety of the employees and the interests of Nova Scotians first in the negotiations on that issue. Mr. Speaker, I see you raising your pen, recognizing the hour. I would make a motion that we do adjourn for the evening to resume debate when we sit tomorrow.
Is that a motion to adjourn debate, I take it?
Yes.
Thank you. There's a motion to adjourn debate on Bill number 36 in Committee of the Whole House on Bills. Is it agreed? Agreed. Thank you. I recognize the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move the committee to now rise, and we don't have any bills to report, just report.
Chairman of the Committee of the Whole House on Bills reports.
Committee's met, made progress, and begs leave to sit again.
Agreed? The Honourable Government House Leader.
Speaker, I move the House to now rise to meet again tomorrow at the hour of 12 noon, and the House will sit until 8 p.m. And the order of business following question period will be continuation of the Committee of the Whole House on bills. And if time permits, we'll do second reading of public bills. And I think that will probably take care of the day. Speaker, move would now rise.
Motion is the House adjourned until tomorrow at noon hour. It's agreed? All those in favor say aye. Aye. Aren't reminded nay. Motion is carried. We're adjourned until noon tomorrow.